In 1867, Secretary of State William Seward purchased Alaska from the Russians for $7.2 million. Critics called it Seward's folly. History proved it one of the most consequential strategic acquisitions of all time. On the very same day he signed that deal, Seward's mind was already somewhere else. He commissioned a report on another vast frozen territory, a place with immense shorelines and vast mineral wealth. A territory that, he argued, could help America command the commerce of the world. That territory was Greenland, and now, more than a century and a half later, that same idea has not only returned, it has plunged the United States and its closest allies into the most severe diplomatic crisis in a generation. 1 week ago, the United States captured a sitting head of state, Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. Immediately after, President Donald Trump turned his focus north. He renewed a threat he's made for years, to acquire Greenland. But this time, the language was different. The White House said utilizing the U.S. military is always an option at the commander-in-chief's disposal. He then backed that threat with an economic ultimatum to 8 European nations. Agree to a deal for the United States to purchase Greenland or face escalating tariffs. So we have to ask, is this just another headline-grabbing negotiation? Or are we witnessing the first real-time unraveling of the American-led international order, starting with a fight over the world's largest island? This is not a real estate deal. This is a geopolitical earthquake. To understand why this is happening, you must first understand why Greenland has been a constant, quiet obsession in the backrooms of American power. Greenland is not just big. At 836,000 square miles, it's over 3 times the size of Texas. It is the world's largest island, but its true value is not in its landmass, but in its position. Look at a map. Greenland is the stopper in the bottle of the North Atlantic. It sits astride the Guyuk Gap, the critical maritime choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. During the Cold War, controlling this gap meant trapping Soviet submarines. Today, it means monitoring every ship and plane moving between the Arctic and the Atlantic. This is why U.S. interest is older than you think. In 1910, a U.S. ambassador to Denmark suggested swapping a piece of the Philippines for Greenland and the Danish West Indies. In 1946, with the Cold War dawning, President Harry Truman secretly offered Denmark $100 million in gold for the island. The official memo stated the control of Greenland was indispensable to the safety of the United States. Denmark said no, but a compromise was struck. The U.S. got to build Thule Air Base, now called Pituffik Space Base, a critical node in America's missile early warning system that still operates today. For decades, that was enough. The status quo held. Greenland remained a self-governing territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. But 3 new factors have shattered that stability. First, the ice is melting. Climate change is opening Arctic shipping lanes and potentially exposing vast mineral wealth beneath Greenland's retreating ice sheet. Second, new competitors have arrived. Russia sees the Arctic as vital to its defense, and China, calling itself a near-Arctic state, is pursuing a polar Silk Road. Third, the rules themselves are changing, and that brings us to January 2026. The crisis began to accelerate just days after the dramatic capture of Venezuelan President Maduro. President Trump, aboard Air Force One, turned the conversation north. "We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security," he said, claiming it was covered with Russian and Chinese ships. The language from his team became more direct. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt called acquiring Greenland a national security priority, adding that utilizing the U.S. military is always an option. Top aide Stephen Miller argued, "Nobody's going to fight the U.S. over the future of Greenland." Then came the economic lever. On January 17th, President Trump posted his terms on Truth Social. He threatened to impose a 10% tariff on exports from 8 European countries starting February 1st: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, and Finland. That tariff would jump to 25% on June 1st. And these tariffs, he declared, would remain until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. The rationale? A sense of historical grievance and a transactional view of alliances. The United States has been trying to do this transaction for over 150 years, he wrote. We have subsidized Denmark and all of the countries of the European Union. by not charging them tariffs. Now, after centuries, it is time for Denmark to give back. World peace is at stake. But here is the critical question. What is the real goal? Publicly, it's framed as pure national security. We need Greenland for national security, not minerals, Trump has stated. Yet look at the analysis from those closest to him. Gary Cohn, Trump's former director of the National Economic Council, told the BBC at Davos that this may be part of a negotiation. He suggested the real aims might be a larger U.S. military presence and an offtake agreement for Greenland's vast deposits of rare earth minerals, elements critical for everything from fighter jets to the AI and quantum computing race now dominating global strategy. This reveals a potential disconnect. The public face is a 19th-century-style territorial acquisition for defense. The private reality may be a 21st-century scramble for technological supremacy, using maximum pressure as a tactic. And the pressure is not just economic, there is a psychological dimension. In a message to Norway's Prime Minister, Trump linked his stance to a personal slight. Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace. He has also pointed to the UK's plan to return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius as an act of great stupidity and a security failure that justifies his Greenland push. So we have a multi-pronged strategy: military hints, economic coercion, and personal diplomatic pressure. But who in this scenario is actually being heard the least? Let's be clear. Greenland is not a piece of unowned real estate. It is a self-governing political community with a population of about 56,000 people, mostly indigenous Inuit. In 1979, it gained home rule from Denmark. In 2009, it achieved self-government, with the legal right to move toward full independence. The response from Nuuk has been unequivocal anger. Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen has called the U.S. rhetoric completely unacceptable and disrespectful. Following the Venezuela operation, he said plainly, "That's enough now." Thousands have protested in the capital, a massive number given the small population. A Greenlandic filmmaker told CNN the talk of a purchase represents a total show of disrespect, noting that in Greenland, no individual can even own land, making the real estate framing particularly offensive. Malu Rosing, an advisor on Arctic affairs, explains that this rhetoric stirs up memories of indigenous land being treated as a commodity and the traumatic 1953 forced relocation of Inuit families to make way for the Thule Air Base. It is, in essence, a re-traumatization. Polls show most Greenlanders favor eventual independence from Denmark, but an overwhelming majority reject becoming part of the United States. So the fundamental equation is broken. The U.S. is negotiating with Denmark over a territory that has its own government. It is pressuring Europe over a people who have made their opposition clear. This isn't just a diplomatic misfire. It's a fundamental failure to recognize the agency of the very population at the center of the crisis. And that failure is about to trigger a response that could reshape the global economy. Europe is not backing down. In fact, the united, furious response from America's oldest allies has been one of the most significant developments of this crisis. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen stated, "Europe won't be blackmailed." Leaders from the 8 targeted nations issued a rare joint statement. Tariff threats undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. We will continue to stand united. We are committed to upholding our sovereignty. But words are one thing, actions are another. European leaders are now actively discussing deploying a weapon that has never been used before, the trade bazooka. Officially known as the Anti-Coercion Instrument, ACI, this is the EU's most powerful economic deterrent. Created in 2023 with scenarios like Chinese coercion in mind, it was never intended for use against the United States. But now, French President Emmanuel Macron and others are calling for its activation. What does this bazooka do? It goes far beyond simple retaliatory tariffs on goods. It could restrict or block U.S. companies' access to the EU's single market for services. Think tech giants, financial firms, and intellectual property. Impose restrictions on U.S. investment into the EU. Ban U.S. companies from public procurement contracts across Europe. This is critical because the U.S.-EU trade relationship is a two-way street. In goods, the EU runs a large surplus, exporting over $530 billion to the U.S., in 2024. But in services, the heart of the modern U.S. economy, America holds a massive surplus of over $109 billion. The bazooka is designed to strike at that vulnerable, high-value flank. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen put it bluntly in Davos. The proposed additional tariffs are a mistake, especially between long-standing allies. And in politics as in business, a deal is a deal. She warned that plunging us into a downward spiral would only aid the very adversaries we are both so committed to keeping out. The stage is now set. The U.S. has threatened tariffs to start February 1st. The EU is preparing a retaliatory package that could automatically hit $108 billion in U.S. imports by February 6th. We are literally days away from the possible outbreak of a full-scale transatlantic trade war. And hovering over all of this is the unthinkable question: what happens to NATO? Secretary of State Marco Rubio has reportedly told lawmakers the plan is to buy rather than invade. But Trump himself has not ruled out force. Gary Cohn, the former Trump advisor, spelled out the red line. Invading an independent country that is part of NATO seems to me to be a little bit over the edge at this point. The Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, is now involved, trying to broker talks in Davos. But the damage may already be done. When the most powerful member of a defensive alliance threatens the territory of another member, what truly is the alliance for? This is no longer just about an island. It is about trust, law, and the survival of the institutional bedrock of Western security since 1949. To make sense of this, we need to zoom out. The Greenland crisis is not an isolated incident. It is the most visible symptom of a much larger, more dangerous trend. The geopolitical risk firm Eurasia Group released its Top Risks for 2026 report earlier this month. Its number one global risk: U.S. political revolution. They argue the U.S. itself under Trump is now the principal source of global instability as it attempts to dismantle checks, capture the machinery of government, and weaponize it. Greenland is a case study in that risk. It shows a U.S. administration willing to prioritize unilateral control over alliance management, use economic coercion against strategic partners, disregard the self-determination of smaller populations in pursuit of great power competition. This aligns with what Eurasia Group calls the Donroe Doctrine, risk number 3, an approach that doesn't want to be the world's policeman but intends to assert direct control over America's own backyard. Now they are defining backyard in hemispheric and even hemispheric plus terms to include the strategic approaches to the continent. The long-term consequences are profound. First, European strategic autonomy will accelerate fast. They are already discussing it. Denmark's Minister for European Affairs said, "We are on the edge of a new world order. We see a United States with an enormous condescending rhetoric towards Europe. This crisis will pour jet fuel on EU efforts to build its own defense and economic sovereignty, potentially leading to a fundamental decoupling from U.S. leadership. Second, it hands a massive strategic gift to Russia and China. As von der Leyen warned, a transatlantic split would only aid the very adversaries we are both so committed to keeping out." Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has already waded in, cynically noting that Greenland is not a natural part of Denmark, a phrase echoing his justification for the invasion of Ukraine. They will exploit every crack. Third, it may fatally undermine America's own goals. The Belfer Center analysis at Harvard is clear. The United States does not need to own Greenland to achieve its security and economic interests, and Trump's current approach may be counterproductive to those interests. By alienating Greenlanders, Danes, and all of Europe, the U.S. could lose the very cooperative access it seeks, making the region more contested, not more secure. The lesson is that in the 21st century, hard power and coercion are blunt instruments. Lasting security in the Arctic won't come from a flag-planting ceremony, but from partnerships, respect for international law, and cooperation with the people who live there. The current path achieves the opposite. We began with history, with Seward's vision after the Alaska Purchase. The thread from 1867 to 1946 to today is clear. American strategists have always seen the overwhelming logic of Greenland's position. But the world of 2026 is not the world of 1946. We no longer live in an age of colonies and uncontested great power transactions. The people of Greenland have a voice. Europe is a powerful, united bloc, and the rules-based order, however frayed, still holds enough weight to mobilize a devastating economic counterattack. The coming days will be decisive. Will tariffs snap into place on February 1st? Will Europe pull the trigger on its trade bazooka? Will the emergency NATO talks in Davos find a face-saving off-ramp, perhaps around increased U.S. military access or mineral rights, as Gary Cohn suggested? But beyond the immediate crisis lies the deeper question for every American. What is our nation's role in the world? Is it that of a hegemon that takes what it deems necessary, alliances be damned? Or is it that of a leader who builds security through partnership, even when it's slower and more complex? Greenland is the test. A frozen, distant island has become the hottest spot on Earth, a mirror held up to American power and purpose. The reflection we see will define the next century. The world is watching, and the clock is ticking down to February 1st.